Hello, everyone. My name is Gil Penalosa, and this is Cities for Everyone, the webinar where every other Tuesday I invite fascinating people to share their stories, their experience, their knowledge, so that all of us can become better, passionate advocates on creating equitable, sustainable, and fun cities so that everyone can live healthier and happier. Originally, I'm from Bogota, Colombia, but I've been living in Toronto now for 26 years. And 20 years ago, I created 880 Cities, a Canadian nonprofit. And I've been fortunate to have worked in over 350 cities. And this webinar is one way of giving back, always free. Today, we have an amazing guest. My guest is Professor Meredith Glaser. She is an American. She was born in California, went to school and PhD at UC Berkeley, but now lives in the Netherlands as its CEO of urban cycling. And she's also a professor at the university. Professor on what? On cycling. So imagine that transition. So she's going to tell us why mobility transitions do not start with mobility. It's more inclusive. Meredith, thank you very, very much for having accepted the invitation. Please tell us about yourself, about mobility, and about cycling in cities. Thanks a lot, Meredith, for being our guest today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, I'm also connected to Davis. I went to undergraduate at UC Davis. So for those who are here calling in from Davis, go Aggies. And go Bears. You know, we have to acknowledge the UC Berkeley Bears as well. But I would actually like to kick it off with just knowing a little bit more about you all. So I'm going to experiment a little bit and not just kick off with the keynote, but actually hear a little bit more about you guys. So this is a Mentimeter. What, Gil, can you just confirm that this is what you see is the blue to get the conversation going? Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
The
So you
blue, yeah,
scan,
and the QR code.
yeah, and the QR code. Scan the QR code with your phone on the photo, or you go to menti.com. You plug in this code, and I see that already 20 people are in, 23, 26, 27. And as soon as I press this next arrow, you will get the first question to this poll. So as soon as we have a few more coming in here, then I will press the next button. And you know, sometimes webinars can get a little bit stale if you just kick off with the keynote. So this is why I think it's nice to hear a little bit from you all and to there's just a few simple questions. I mean, actually, maybe some of them are a little bit harder towards the end, but it's just a way I do this in the classroom a lot. I teach master's level students, and we also do a lot of professional development online using our leadership program and our Coursera courses. And this is, you know, it's a way to be interactive, but also on topic. So I see that there's still people coming in, but I think I'm just going to move forward because it's staying at around 100. So I am going to move to the next slide here. So this is question 1. In an average week, how do you mostly travel for your daily needs? So when we think about our daily travel, right, this is what we do for getting essential goods, going to work, dropping off the kids at school, grocery, going to the doctors. You know, what's in an average week? How do you mostly travel? So already there's 60, 70 people submitted some answers. And what I love about this poll is that you can just see immediately, right? Things that are trends and patterns that are happening. So we have the first place is in a car. And so this can be either driving a car yourself or as a passenger. And the second is walking. So we now have 136 answered. So a few more might come in. In third place is bicycling, fourth, public transit, and fifth, I get around another way, which I would be curious to know what those ways are. And this could be super interesting if we could add more complexity to this statistical analysis. Like, what if we did gender differences, right? So then what if we could stratify by male, female? Then what would we see? We might see more walking. We might see more public transportation. What if we did it by geography? So that would mean in more suburban or rural areas, we would probably see more car use, right? Whereas in more city centers, we might see more walking, bicycling, public transit. Now, what this doesn't account for, of course, is combining modes of travel, right? Oftentimes, with public transit, for instance, here in the Netherlands, a very common way to get to the train is by bicycle. So actually, you're combining modes. So there's a lot of limitations to this type of data collection, but we can see that we're holding strong at number one, being in a car, driving a car, or in a car. So we're going to go to the second question. Now, this might be a little bit harder to do. So what this asks you to do is to divide up with a 100 points, let's say. How many of those points are dedicated to space for greenery, for play, for mobility, or for commerce? All right, and this is, try to consider your home street. So envision your home street. Maybe you're there right now, or maybe you have to kind of think about it. From building edge to building edge, how much space is for these different things? And this can be an indication for how our public space is used, right? And what our priorities are in society. So we have 20 people now dividing up this space. And this would be really interesting to do also by geography, right? Where depending on where you live, excuse me, what type of urban environment or rural environment or peri-urban, suburban. And it shows the differences of importance, right? And what our policymakers provide to our citizens for different types of space and how it's allocated. And space in urban areas is also such a finite commodity and asset, right? So we could also wonder, could this space be used for different types of things? For example, space for greenery might overlap with space for play or socializing, right? And space for mobility is a pretty blanket way to describe that type of space. Maybe there's space for mobility that also incorporates permeable surfaces that has some greenery aspect to it. So in cities especially, we are talking about, resilience and green infrastructure and how our space can be used for many different types of aims and ambitions, and especially in policy around sustainability. And in places where there's less or more informal economies, this public space could be used a lot more for kind of pop-up or temporary economic activities like food carts. And I remember traveling in India, and this is a very common sight, is having different types of economic services just kind of pop up in public space, which brings such vibrance and an eclectic activity to the space. Fantastic. So we do see, though, that the number one amount of space is dedicated to mobility by far, right? With our little poll here. So more than, if I think I can interpret this correctly, it's 58% because it's all divided by 100, right? So 58% of space in front of your home street is dedicated to mobility. And for the most part, I would assume that a lot of that space is for cars. Whereas in the previous question, actually, there were a lot of people who used bicycling and walking and other types of mobility. So we do see this imbalance, right? And you could also ask yourself as a resident, what would you like to see more of on your street? I have two kids. I would love to see, even here in Amsterdam, more space for them to play instead of parking spaces for cars that mostly sit there. So this is also a tool you could use in an informal way with even with children as well. I've done this with my kids to go around in our neighborhood and kind of map out how much space is used for these types of activities and what would different population groups appreciate the most or use the most for street space. The last one for now, I would love for you to reflect briefly about riding a bicycle in your context and what is it a symbol of? As a professor of cycling, I'm often asked if that cycling means road racing and oh, you must wear Lycra and have a race bike. When actually that's not the case. Looks like freedom. Freedom is physical activity, autonomy, climate change. This is interesting because I was actually expecting some different types of words here. Did I see getting shit done? I think I did. Excuse the profanity. Um, um, Exercise, health, convenience, sustainability. But I do see some very interesting ones. These words are moving around very fast, so it's hard to track them. But I see other things like poor, um, privilege. Very interesting. So we see danger. This would be very interesting to map the connotations associated with these words, and also by geography, by gender, by socioeconomic status, um, and uh, so here in the Netherlands, riding a bicycle for daily travel is not associated with, for example, being poor or being a risk taker. And in fact, there's also almost an effect where people would want to not display their wealth or social status by riding a very, old, rusty black bike. And some of that is actually changing nowadays with the increase of e-bikes and very expensive e-bikes for daily travel. So wow, 160 people. We have a lot of different words here, and it would be very interesting to go in depth onto each of these. Um, well, thank you for partaking in this first section. I do have um, sorry, I'm changing screens here to share another few questions in a little while, and hopefully we'll have time. But I also want to start with a confession. I grew up with my parents driving me everywhere. And I, was growing up in America and California suburbs, and like any other teenager, I couldn't wait to turn 16. Because 16 is this magical number. I know we have many North Americans here. But for those who aren't familiar, 16 is this magical age. It means so much more than any other number because this is the age that you can get your driver's license, right? So um, after passing my driver's exam, my parents surprised me with a well-used 1994 Volvo sedan in that classic seaweed green. And I immediately upgraded to a 10-disc CD player. And finally, I could experience freedom, right? Um, Freedom, independence, autonomy. My wheels brought me everywhere. Social outings and sports and schools, jobs. And life by car was and still is inescapable. Even if I go back to the street where I grew up, it has not changed. This is in San Luis Obispo, California. And cars dominate, our lives as Americans. And it's kind of saddening to see that this place has not changed in 30 years. But why is that? How can that happen? Well, where I come from, it is impossible to ignore the central role of the automobile in everyday life. My friends and family say things like, oh, traffic is awful, but I just listened to my audiobook and thank God autonomous vehicles are here. My kids will never have to get a driver's license. Habits have adapted to traffic and in turn, an imagination of what is even possible. But who could blame them? Because if cars and traffic is all we've ever known, how can we expect anyone to imagine that a totally different reality that does not yet exist? So you can perhaps imagine my shock when I moved to the Netherlands about 15 years ago. It was late August. It was around 8:30 in the morning. I was rudely awoken by the sounds of bicycle bells and laughing children. And this was my view. I was a bit shocked. I didn't know what was going on. It sounded like there was a street party happening at 8:30 in the morning. And actually, what I realized, it took a whole minute to realize what was happening, is that this was just an average school drop-off morning. Kids and parents, they were just dropping their kids off at school. And this was a shock to me because when I was a kid, I have to go back a slide here, that this was school drop off for me, right? Bumper to bumper traffic, in the back seat, wondering when we were going to get there. So this was a fresh revelation. And 15 years ago, in my young mind, I was convinced that the bicycle was the reason, that it was the center of the transition. And I wanted to learn why and how the bicycle saved the day. But it turns out that I learned a lot on this journey. I learned that in the 1960s, Dutch cities were making space for the car. This is a rendering of a planned highway that would cut through the city center of Amsterdam with the latest engineering innovations. I learned that cars were choking Dutch cities and causing extreme levels of air pollution and traffic violence. I learned that there are bottom-up social movements like this one that was actually quite small, but very effective in their campaign, using strong language like "Stop the child murder." I also learned that John Lennon and Yoko Ono were even here in the city center of Amsterdam protesting environmental degradation. And what was their symbol of peace and humility? A bicycle. Now, the highway plans didn't materialize, and many of you probably know this story and the fight that ensued. And so what I learned, that history plays a very strong role in how transitions occur, how they are influenced. And I learned that mobility is a social and technical system. So it's called a socio-technical system. It's embedded in environments, in behaviors, in social practices, cultures, institutions. I don't know if the video is working well for you. It kind of is stopping and for me, but this is my 6-year-old having breakfast. She's learning as she lives here and grows up here that this is a very typical and accepted way of having breakfast in the morning. Um, and I also learned that 40 years ago, my street looked and felt very different. But also, let's be clear about what is different. Right? The buildings are the same. The school is there. The church down the street is there. The apartments are there, right? The housing, the buildings have a long lifespan, but it's the streets, right? It's the public domain that has changed. And so this is where I finally come to my confession that I have to accept that I was wrong. It wasn't the bicycle that saved the day. Maybe it was the streets, right? Changing our streets. And this space is the lifeblood, the arteries of cities. It represents 1/3 of public space. It's many cities' largest assets. And this experience of acknowledging that I missed something, it really transformed my own knowledge and my own assumptions about urban planning, about the knowledge for urban planning, and about streets and who they could be for. So I started this new mission of uncovering how streets can be the center of change. And how our cities have developed over time shows us a lot about how the nature of this public space, of streets, change. And this is crucial for cities because cities are rapidly growing, right? And policymakers, local governments, and citizens, they face overcrowding, housing shortages, inequality, resource scarcity, ecological threats, and overall insecurity of basic human needs. But no matter where you are in the world, streets secure a lifeline to opportunity, to schools, jobs, food, social contact, medical care. But this access is unevenly distributed because still today, cities continue to cement 20th century ideologies of the use of public space for cars, for concrete, and commuting. And with inequities soaring and access to basic needs diminishing, cities and governments continue to widen roads and to build infrastructure that cement these ideologies. Now, my argument here isn't to condemn growth, right? Or to ban cars, but to bring awareness to the limitations of this dominant narrative. And this narrative has become so etched in the field of transportation that the field cannot see the forest for the trees. So if you go from Rome, Paris, San Francisco, especially in the global north, but also increasingly in the global south, we see that the bureaucracy and administration, economic models depend on and are a result of this focus, this narrative. And the narrative of cars, efficiency, concrete, commuting, it's really a century old, 100 years or more, maybe. A century old. So, what are the solutions forward? Well, more of the same, really. The narrative has become so dominant that even the field of transportation, if you go and Google, the future of transport, you just see more of the same, but automated, seamless, smart, connected, optimized, right? So the question then is, in this future of sustainable mobility, will inequities not deepen? Will our cities and regions just reach peak concrete? How will fundamental challenges stemming from automobility be solved? Well, in this future of sustainable urban mobility, I will still need to teach my daughters to hold my hand before crossing the street, right? The good news is that policies and solutions to reduce automobility are really widely known, right? And the full burden of automobility is also well known. For instance, millions of preventable deaths, physical inactivity, mental ill-being, social isolation, the consumption of land, loss of biodiversity, waste, inefficient use of public space, disruption of vulnerable communities, social injustices, and more. And where do these challenges, which I'm sure many of you are all working on very hard in all of your work, where do these challenges touch down? On our streets and in our public space. So how can we change? Or what is needed to change? Or how do we even think about change when this is so complex? Well, one reason that it's very challenging to solve a lot of these issues in our public space is that when it comes to change, transport and mobility is a particular case because this field is founded on and gravitates towards standards, designs, predictions, models, guidelines to maximize efficiency and to reduce complexity. But in practice, we see that mobility is a complex system. The way we move is more than just traffic. The way that we spend our time is more than just an algorithm. The way we move through time and space actually touches the very core of our identities. And this complexity generates uncertainties. It produces fear and lock-in, right? And it's not that other fields don't face this complexity. They do, but other fields are more aware of these complexities. And I'll give you one example. So public health is one example of a discipline that has a long tradition of understanding behaviors as part of systems with many overlapping variables. This is a model, it's called the socio-ecological model of health. And what it shows us is that there are multi-levels of and overlapping, intersecting levels of behavior change and that cross all these different layers, right? So if we're thinking about interventions, we actually have to think very holistically. But the benefit of this is that it allows us to unpack the system. So let's bring in a system. This, you might think, whoa, what is going on here, right? So there are a couple research groups at, is it Columbia? Let's see. It's so small. I'm pretty sure it's Columbia. A group of scholars came together to try to understand and unpack the system dynamics of obesity. So here, what you're looking at is one corner of this model. And what this process does is allows us to identify a range of policy levers and the diversity of interventions, is unpacking the system. And it just so happens that public health and transport are two fields that are extremely fragmented and siloed from each other. And they could learn a lot from each other in order to understand change. So when we study mobility or when we talk about mobility and its relation with the urban and social context, it actually becomes very clear that the bicycle is a powerful lens to unpack this system. And how do we, as academics, as practitioners, as policymakers, how do we start to make sense of all of the complexities? Well, take apart the system elements, right? Combine different angles, different concepts, different domains. I get inspired by talking with people from all over the world who are sociologists and geographers, engineers, mathematicians, and they're actually using the bicycle or cycling to answer their own fundamental questions. And maybe most pressing is, why is change so hard? So why is change so hard? But what we are actually doing is shifting a paradigm, right? A narrative that is 100 years old. And shifting that paradigm, we are facing a choice to take an approach that will teach us things we cannot know from other sources than the approach itself. So that means we are questioning our own knowledge, our own assumptions, and our own experiences. And here I will borrow a fantastic quote from the famous philosopher L.A. Paul in her book From Transformative Experience. When we face a choice like this, we can't know what our lives will be like until we've undergone the new experience. But if we don't undergo the experience, we won't know what we're missing. So with this, what I emphasize is that we have to just act. And there are many cities around the world who are acting and who are taking on this challenge of creating a new reality that didn't yet exist. For example, instead of taking up space for inactivity and stunting life, what if our streets started life, creating room for physical activity, well-being, and autonomy, instead of spaces that privilege masculinity and metal and machinery? What if our spaces emancipated the female body for personal and economic freedom for all genders, races, and classes? Instead of limiting access to healthy foods, and especially in food desert communities, what if we reclaimed streets to become a source of healthy food? And even more, what if street space itself could be a source of food production? Instead of numbing concrete and asphalt that isolates people from communities, what if citizens reclaimed streets to tell their own stories of local heritage? Now, while reframing the debate can certainly influence the solutions, and I'm sure, we all look at these images and we think, wow, that's incredible, right? What a new imaginary that it's become. I was recently actually in Barcelona as well, Gil, and I was so honored to participate in a school revolt in Barcelona, where I myself took one of these benches and put it on the street to help out with this school, where they closed down the street to cars for 45 minutes to let the children play a little bit longer. Many of these inspiring examples, however, are temporary. They're short term, they're seasonal, and few have taken root to producing lasting shifts. So why is this? How can we extend the impact of these small actions? They are not so small, by the way. I don't mean to say small, but they are small in scale, but they are highly impactful to the community there. My heart was racing when I was putting this bench on the street. It was definitely a new form of activism that I had not experienced before, but was so grateful to take part in it. And clearly, these actions are politicized, because this space is politicized. The space that we are using to open up for people, for children, for health, its use is contested and it's embedded in systems of power. So when we talk about streets, what we are actually talking about are systems, networks, and distributions of power. Even thinking back to this model that I showed you, the system dynamics model, who decided which variables were present or absent or linked to others? How were those decisions made and on what grounds? The version of that system dynamics model we see, there's a lot of hidden dynamics that are unseen. Now, the disciplines of urban planning and transport have always been closely linked to power, right? Visible, hidden, invisible power. There are some really fantastic photos and also historical archives about events like highway planning, right, with Le Corbusier in Rio de Janeiro. So shaping the urban environment. And this, I think this photo is very emblematic of this critique of urban planning, that it has been in the hands of a few. And these decisions have predicated how our bodies can or cannot move through time and space, and how our access to opportunity is denied or accepted. So I'm looking at the time here, and I'm going to shift forward because I'm realizing that I'm talking too much. But what is left unknown, right? Going back to this idea that there are things that will not be known. It has a direct consequence for political action. So how can we elevate that non-known to being known? So I am left with another confession that once again, I am wrong, because it's not about bikes. It's not about streets, but is it power? Is it knowledge? Is it actually questioning the very foundation and production of knowledge? And then who am I as an outsider, right? The American in the Netherlands, being a bicycle professor in Belgium. Who am I as an outsider to say what the driving force of change in any given city is? Who am I to try to problematize reclaiming streets as a disruption of power, right? But what I can do is I can empower, or I can try to shift from understanding power to empowering action. And what does this mean to empower transitions? This is a lot of our work as academics who work on the bridge of research and practice. And this is a lot of my work personally and professionally at Urban Cycling Institute and at Ghent and University of Amsterdam, is to understand this bridge better. So this is when you can ask yourself, what are you going to do tomorrow that's different from today? And this is how we can empower the transition. Because at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, whether we're in the academic community, in practice, in government, what impact are we trying to achieve? What does it mean to be a leader in the science and practice of sustainable urban mobility, of health, of whatever practice you are in? And then most importantly, do we have the tenacity, the audacity, and the endurance to actually act and to dance with the system of change and influence that system?
What would be your call to action? People, this is about becoming passionate advocates. What can people do?
I think this is a very personal question. because I don't consider myself an advocate. I don't consider myself an activist. And I think when I was in Barcelona recently, and I took that bench and I put it out in the street, a part of me changed my perception and assumption of what activism is. And I think that anyone listening here needs to think about what is activism to them, and that it can be in many different forms. Whether that's riding a bicycle with your child, that can be a form of activism. Um, and so I would say the move from advocacy to activism is needed. But activism can take many different forms, and it can be very personal. And I would say, what can you do in your uh, in the state that you are in, whatever your comfort level is, um, what can you do to take action?
Thank you, Meredith. I hope that everybody gets a message very clear. This is not a time to be spectators. Do whatever you feel like on whatever topic. It can be about cycling, or it can be about trees or parks or walking, but do something. Write that email, make that phone call up the radio stations, go to the public meetings, do something, because it's about everyone. Thank you, Meredith. What a great presentation. I think that so much learning. I hope that everybody who watches this video will share it with decision makers, elected officials, city staff, with advocates, with media, with friends, and use it at the universities, at the schools. What a great session. Thank you, Meredith, and I hope to see everyone every other Tuesday. Thank you.